Today's video is on the Civil War. Realistically, there are not too many things you will need to know about the Civil War itself in relation to the AP exam. Again, the College Board is interested in comprehension of concepts through examples, rather than expecting you to be able to rattle off details of events such as battles. But here are the broad strokes. First, we are going to look at the progression of secession. Well, that rhymes. It was basically a three-step process. After the election of 1860, all the states you see here in dark blue decided to secede from the Union. Why? The South believed that Lincoln was going to push for the abolition of slavery. Lincoln was a committed free soiler, and at least in 1860, insisted that he was not interested in ending slavery where it already existed, only preventing its spread into the West. These states, however, refused to even put Lincoln's name on the ballot, and were using that fact to prove that the South as a region had no say in who became president, and therefore felt justified in leaving the Union. Lincoln, for his part, believed that Southern states had agreed to be part of a union, and had no legal justification to leave just because they were unhappy with political decisions. Under this legal theory, known as compact theory, Lincoln would continue to refer to the war as a domestic insurrection, citing that the South had no authority to leave the Union. The South disagreed and said that under Enlightenment theories, people who were dissatisfied with their government had the right to establish their own. Of course, this theory did not take into account that enslaved people were also people with individual rights as well. The Upper South, the states you see here in gray, were unsure about secession. Lincoln had assured the country that he would fight against this rebellion, and the Upper South was not sure if this newfound Confederacy would be able to survive against the North, who had many material advantages over the South. Lincoln agreed to protect an important fort off the coast of South Carolina called Fort Sumter. The fort was one of the few left in southern states that had not already been seized by the Confederacy. The Confederates surrounded the fort with soldiers so that no one could come in or out, forcing Lincoln into an important decision. Break the blockade by trying to resupply the fort, leave it alone, or fire at the Confederate soldiers. Ultimately, Lincoln chose to try to resupply the fort, which meant the South fired first. But the South won the battle decisively and took the fort. This means that the Upper South was convinced that this Confederacy thing had a chance and seceded after the Confederacy's successful outcome at Fort Sumter. The Upper and Lower Southern states then became what they referred to as the Confederate States of America. There was a final attempt at compromise, which had always worked in the past, but it quickly fell by the wayside. Why had America's ability to compromise deteriorated to the point of civil war? We can note three reasons. First, previous compromises like the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, as well as the Dred Scott decision and the Missouri Compromise, all had different and sometimes conflicting or overlapping directives. The Dred Scott decision seemed to cancel out popular sovereignty, and popular sovereignty canceled out the Missouri Compromise. Another compromise just seemed like it would add to the confusion. 2. Issues regarding the spread of slavery in the West had escalated to the point of serious violence. Bleeding Kansas and the caning of Sumner, as well as attempts at a slave uprising such as the one attempted by John Brown, simply escalated the anger and further polarized both sides. Finally, over time, Americans began to identify as Southerners or Northerners rather than Americans. The fragile unity that had existed at the beginning of the century had deteriorated to the point of extreme sectionalism. But consider that this may be a case where unity was not the most important thing for America. Slavery was a horrific and disturbing wrong, and continuing to compromise would simply allow for the institution to continue. It is important to note that there were slave states that chose to stay in the Union. These states you see here in yellow, including the great state of Maryland, remained in the Union despite being slave states. Why? One reason was that Lincoln denied secessionist leaders in these states something called the right of habeas corpus, which meant he allowed them to remain in jail indefinitely, slowing the secessionist cause in those states substantially. The border states were important to the Union cause for several reasons. 1. The Kentucky and Missouri border with the Mississippi River was a valuable transportation route. 2. The state of Maryland bordered the D.C. capital, and because Virginia decided to secede, Maryland was the only safe border surrounding the capital. If Maryland had seceded, the capital would have been surrounded by enemy territory, which likely would have meant the capital would have had to move to Philadelphia or New York. 3. The border states going to the Confederacy would have added a large number of people and industrialized resources to the Confederate cause. Keeping the border states in the Union ended up being important military strategy. But the border states were in a constant precarious state. Citizens of these states were extremely split on the issue of secession. Lincoln had to resort to martial law, meaning rule by the military, in order to keep the secessionists from gaining power. Mobilization is an important part of any war. Who's going to fight the war? How are you going to get people to fight? How are you going to fund the war and gather resources? This graph shows the vast material advantages of the North, which made many believe the war would be over quickly. But they were wrong. The South's advantages were more intangible. The South was much more motivated than expected and recruited the more experienced generals. Both sides ended up drafting people to fight, but initially both sides had a lot of people who served as volunteers, particularly in the South. The North had a lot more people, and additionally, the North was able to forcefully enlist immigrants. So even though enthusiasm waned over the course of the war in the North, the larger population base meant that the North would have the larger army. Ironically, one way to get out of being drafted in the South was if you were an owner of 20 or more slaves. So yes, this means that poor men were fighting the rich man's battle. Since there is little doubt that this war was primarily being fought by the South to preserve slavery. Funding is another important aspect of war mobilization. Essentially, there are 3 ways to raise money for a war: the smart way, the so-so way, and the stupid way. The smart way is to tax your people. No one likes taxes, but you can raise a lot of money that you don't have to pay back. The so-so way is to issue bonds. Bonds are loans that you give to a country or institution that you support. It can raise a lot of money, but bonds need to be paid back with interest, which can put a country into debt. The stupid way is also, not surprisingly, the easy way, which is to simply print money. Printing money creates a tremendous increase in prices and drastically decreases the value of each dollar. So how did each side raise money? The North increased taxes, but also issued bonds. The economy of the North boomed during the war. As the need for factory work increased, so did jobs, and industrial profits soared. In the South, because the country was so new and had limited access to financial resources, the Confederate government felt they had no choice but to print money. So by the end of the war, Confederate currency had inflated 9,000%, meaning that, for example, a loaf of bread that was worth $1 at the beginning of the war cost $9,000 by the end. The value of Confederate currency was essentially worthless. An important political consideration in American history is the claim made by some that the South was not really fighting over slavery. Rather, they say, they were taking an ideological position on the supremacy of states over federal authority. While it is true that throughout the first half of the 19th century, there were many disagreements involving states' rights, recall, for example, the Whiskey Rebellion, the Nullification Crisis, Marbury versus Madison, those issues typically ended with a nod towards federal supremacy over the rights of states. An important example that demonstrates that the Civil War was about slavery is the Confederate Constitution. The vast majority of historians believe that the Confederate Constitution was written with the primary purpose of preserving slavery in mind. The U.S. Constitution and the Confederate Constitution are remarkably similar. In fact, it is clear that the Confederates merely edited the Constitution to suit their needs, mostly regarding slavery. For example, the Bill of Rights is remarkably similar, except for the fact that the right to own and consider enslaved people property is encoded in the Constitution. Also, the power of the federal government was primarily upheld. There was even an elastic clause included, which is generally considered a place where the federal government can derive its power over the states. So why does all this matter? Race relations are still a problem throughout the United States. Often, people try to use history to justify their views and evaluate our current and past struggles with morality. So undoubtedly, in the United States, in order to be a good citizen, We need to understand why the Civil War was fought using historical evidence and clear thinking. The most important political event of the Civil War, however, was Lincoln's signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. But it did not do what people think it did. It did not free the slaves. It is an important document because it changed the purpose of the war. Before January 1st, 1863, the war was being fought to keep the Union together. The Emancipation Proclamation stated that as each state still in rebellion was defeated, the slaves would be freed, meaning the war now could be fought to free the slaves. There were many changes that came about because of this decision. 1, it helped Lincoln win support from abolitionists. This became an important factor in helping Lincoln win the election of 1864 and gave the North the moral high ground. 2, Britain was considering sending support to the Confederacy. Cotton was an important trade good for them, and when neither side had the moral high ground regarding slavery, the South provided more material advantages for them than the North. But there was also a powerful abolitionist movement in Europe, particularly Britain. So once the war became about ending slavery, any chance of British support for the Confederacy also ended. 3, border states could keep their slaves. This seems odd because Lincoln did have the authority to emancipate slaves in the border states, but secession in border states was still desirable for many who lived there. So allowing the border states to hold on to slavery a bit longer meant the border states stayed loyal to the Union. 4, free African Americans in the North joined the fight for the Union. This was particularly heroic because the Confederacy promised to be particularly harsh towards black soldiers who were captured while fighting against the Confederacy. While most African Americans were not given actual fighting duties, a segregated unit called the Massachusetts 54th fought valiantly for a cause that was of personal importance to them and was immortalized in the film entitled Glory. So, although the Emancipation Proclamation did not directly and immediately free the slaves, it changed the purpose of the war and became the precursor for the 13th Amendment, which directly ended the legal practice of slavery for good. One of Lincoln's most challenging political struggles was the election of 1864. One would think that because the South was not participating in this election, Lincoln would win easily. But after 4 years of bloody and costly battles, many Northerners had lost their taste for war and wanted it to end, even if it meant the South would secede and create their own country. But Lincoln and the Republicans were determined to win the election and the war. Lincoln's opponent was George McClellan, a general Lincoln had fired as the commander of the Union Army. McClellan ran with the promise he would end the war even if it meant the Union would break apart. His party's nickname became Copperheads because they were seen by those determined to keep the Union together as a threat to that unity. Luckily for Lincoln, those determined to end slavery for good, at this point free soilers and abolitionists alike, were determined to push Republicans to victory. But in order to solicit votes from Northerners who wanted to end slavery but were against giving freed blacks freedom and opportunities, he selected a man named Andrew Johnson as his vice president, who appealed to this group. What's the harm? Lincoln probably thought. We will win the election, the war, and Johnson will be useless as vice president. Vice presidents have very limited powers, unless the president dies. More on that in a later lesson. When all was said and done, the Union was brought back together, and the atrocious practice of slavery was finally put to an end, but not without devastatingly high human cost. By far, the Civil War was the most destructive in America's history, and more Americans died than in any other conflict in the history of the United States, including more modern wars like World War II. There were also immense numbers of wounded and permanently injured soldiers. In the South, 1 out of every 3 white American males were gone. But the end of slavery was perhaps America's most important revolution. Americans had reached the point where democracy could not continue unless slavery was abolished. But this is just one aspect of the Civil War's overall legacy, which we will begin to explore in future lessons.